The greatest, or arguably the greatest, Jewish philosopher was, of course, Moses Maimonides, who lived from 1135 to 1204. And he was also the most radical of the medieval proponents of what's come to be called negative theology. Building on some recent important work by Ehud Ben-Or, in particular his book, The Worship of the Heart, a study in Maimonides' philosophy of religion. Building on that work, I propose to discuss the puzzles and paradoxes of negative theology, not as simply peculiar to Maimonides' thought, but as revealing something that can assume great importance for religious life at virtually any time. My discussion will begin with a review of some of the well-known aspects of Maimonides' view. And following that, I'll say again, as I did last night, something about Wittgensteinian views of religious language, and then I'll return to Maimonides' negative theology, and finally I'll consider some philosophical criticisms not only of Maimonides' view, but of the medieval discussion as a whole. Now, a puzzle which confronts any thoughtful reader of Maimonides' great philosophical text, The Guide of the Perplexed, is the following. Maimonides emphatically tells us that no positive predicate which we are able to understand can apply to God. Indeed, the more we apply such predicates, even good or real, to God, thinking thereby to say something literally or even analogically true of God, we, quotes, become like one who likens him to other things, unquotes, which is Maimonides' way of saying we become idolatrous. What leads Maimonides to this conclusion, as it led both Islamic and Christian theologians to, however, much less radical forms of negative theology, was the familiar insistence on God's absolute unity. The following passage from Guide, Book 1, Chapter 50, illustrates the radicalism, as Maimonides is denying that God possesses essential attributes. He also doesn't possess accidental ones. If you are one of those whose ambition it is to rise to a higher level at which things are thought out, if you wish to know with certainty that God is truly one in the sense that there exists no multiplicity whatever in him and no capability of division in any respect, then you must recognize that he has no essential attributes. Those who believe God to be one with many attributes have affirmed his oneness verbally while mentally believing him to be many. This resembles the Christian's formula. This is not praise. This resembles the Christian's formula that he is one but three, and the three are one. Or the dictum of those who reject anthropomorphism and affirm his absolute simplicity by saying, he is one, but he has many attributes, he and his attributes being one. As if our object were to find out what to say rather than what to believe. Given all this, as Ehud Ben-Or remarks, it is surprising that, and I quote Ben-Or, quotes, it is surprising that Maimonides permits both attributes of action and attributes of character, such as merciful, gracious, and long-suffering, which invoke an image of God as a moral person worthy of imitation. Close quote. True, Maimonides qualifies this by saying that, quotes, the meaning is here not that he possesses moral qualities, but that he performs actions that in us proceed from moral qualities. But can it be the case that Maimonides thought that he performs actions is univocal as applied to God and as applied to human beings? Logically speaking, if no attribute, and the answer is unclear, but Maimonides interpreters, I think, disagree what the answer to that one is, but logically speaking, if no attribute that we can think of can be literally or even analogically predicated of God, then performing actions cannot be predicated of God either, can it? This is the familiar antinomy of negative theology. If Maimonides was not aware of it, then what is going on here? I have, by the way, no doubt that he was fully aware of it. I don't wish to suggest that. My language doesn't in any place suggest that. I think Maimonides was unconscious of the difficulty. At this point, this is the point when I return to one of the topics of last night, Wittgenstein's view of religious language as a preparatory. Now, again, my views, by the way, my exegesis of Wittgenstein's views on religious belief, or the views in his lectures on religious belief, was set out in my Gifford lectures, Renewing Philosophy, but I'm not going to repeat the exegesis of specific passages that I did there. For my present purpose, what's important is the following, and I'll be brief because I said some of this at more length last night. On the view that I ascribe to Wittgenstein, religious language and the languages of ordinary empirical description and scientific theorizing are in a way incommensurable, although not in the technical sense in which Kuhn uses incommensurable. The religious believer, qua religious believer, is not, or should not be. I said yesterday that Wittgenstein's account is a normative account, and like many normative accounts, involves a sharp distinction between religious belief and superstition. The religious believer should not be engaged in the prediction of empirical phenomena, and religious faith is not refuted by this or that empirical happening or scientific discovery. To suppose, as many people nowadays do, that, quote, science has refuted religion, unquote, is to have a deeply confused understanding of what real religious belief is. As I emphasized in Renewing Philosophy, this does not mean that Wittgenstein was immunizing religious belief from criticism, although he was saying that one sort of criticism is utterly misguided. One may find what the believer says unintelligible. For instance, one may find that it violates one's sense of what life means, or one may find that religious belief has lost its hold on one, or one has lost one's hold on it, and it now appears as something strange and alien. But what one should not do is claim that one's view, whatever it is mandated by, to use Bernard Williams' phrase, present-day science. Nor, or so I argued in Renewing Philosophy, should one hope that philosophy of language, or analytic philosophy, will be able to tell one whether religious language makes sense, and if so, what sort of sense it makes. There is simply no uncommitted place to stand with respect to the religious dimension of human life. Thus, I reject in particular the view that Wittgenstein is proposing an understanding of religious language as non-cognitive. Of particular importance is the following thought, which runs through all of Wittgenstein's philosophy, that our understanding in our language consists in our ability to use it in the stream of life. Coupled with that thought and closely connected with it is the idea that a given sentence or a given form of words may mean anything or nothing depending on the context in which it occurs. No sentence in itself mandates just one use or just one content. But these thoughts are subject to misinterpretations, which it is important to guard against if we are to bring them to bear on religious language. One of those misinterpretations is the idea that Wittgenstein thought of language as consisting of a determinate number of, quotes, language games, unquotes. I remember Fodor once asking me mockingly, how many language games are there in English? To be sure, Wittgenstein does often refer to some part of language, either actual language or imagined language, or even of exchanges which are highly problematic if thought of as possible parts of a functional language, as language games. But to infer from that the question, how many language games does English consist of, has a sense, or that the question, is the Jewish religion a language game, or is Christianity a language game, or is Zen Buddhism a language game, has a sense, is like supposing that it's because of useful to speak of this or that context. The question, how many contexts are there in the universe, has a sense. Or that the question, is the Jewish religion a context, has a sense. Like the term context, the term language game singles out a part of language for a certain kind of attention, but neither as a determinate denotation apart from a context of use. An even more unfortunate misinterpretation, one that piggybacks on the misinterpretation just described, is the idea that Wittgenstein was saying that religious utterances are true by convention in certain self-enclosed language games. So that, quotes, God exists is supposed to be true by certain so-called language game theologians, to be true by convention in certain traditional religious language games, somewhat as it is true by convention, the conventions of chess, that one does not check the queen. This interpretation seems to me a travesty of Wittgenstein's thought. As Cora Diamond rightly says in the course of a wonderful discussion of Anselm's argument, this is a paper of Cora Diamond's called Riddles and Anselm's Riddles, which first appeared in, I think, a long time ago in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society and is reprinted in her collection, The Realistic Spirit. As she puts it in the course of her discussion of Anselm's argument, the questioning expressed in great riddles is anyone's. The possibility of such questions belongs to language itself and not to any particular language game. The tendency to ask them does not depend on any form of life other than speech itself. It is as much something primitive, something given, as responding to other people, and is indeed found in small children. What then can we say about the intelligibility of religious language? In one sense, there's no problem about its intelligibility. Religious forms of life are a standing possibility for us, if not for everyone, for almost everyone, at least at some point or other in life. Even those who cannot or will not make them their own can, if they are intelligent and sympathetic, enter into them imaginatively, as William James did in the Varieties of Religious Experience. It is through the ways in which religious language develops and is articulated in the life of religious communities and in the lives of religious individuals that it gains its intelligibility. If religious belief is confused or a kind of confusion, as has of course been charged again and again, it is neither a confusion about the grammar of our concepts nor a scientific confusion. If it is a confusion, it is a confusion, one might say, about existence as a whole. And the conviction that it is that sort of confusion is, one may say, a religious conviction as much as what it denounces. But of course, the fact that religious belief is different from philosophical confusion and from scientific confusion does not, in and of itself, show that it isn't, in this more profound sense, a confusion, or a wish fulfillment, or an attempt to escape from life, as many thinkers have charged. As I've already said, it's not the point of Wittgenstein's account to settle the question of the validity of religious belief. What does settle that question? Not, I've said, the mere fact that religious language is used and that that use can be grasped. Religious language gains its meaning from the different religious forms of life, but it is not about those forms of life. The object of religious belief, to use Anselm's phrase, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, does not simply drop out. Religious utterances are not empirical assertions about the religious form of life, and as I already said, they are not conventions, grammatical truths within that form of life. Speaking as a believer, I of course say that what makes those utterances true when they are is directly or indirectly their relation to God. If I were not a believer, I would say that nothing could make them true. For if the assertion that God exists is not true, then nothing conceivable could make it true. The risk the believer runs is not empirical falsity. A religious belief that could be empirically false would be an idolatrous belief. But as the logical positivists rightly said, though for bad reasons, cognitive meaninglessness. I repeat, the risk the believer runs isn't empirical falsity, but cognitive meaninglessness. Just skip a little bit here. Last but not least, and this will bring us back to the issues with which we started, it is part of almost all religious forms of life to say that God, or whatever may be of ultimate concern in the particular religious form of life, the farther shore in Buddhist terminology, or the Atman in Hindu terminology, is not properly conceptualizable by us. There's this theme that the ultimate is not properly conceptualizable by us is much wider than just even theistic religion. The Maimonidean way of expressing that fact by saying that it is idolatrous to take the things we say about God, that he is a person, or that he is good, or that he is all-powerful, or that he is all-knowing, as true either literally or analogically, is indeed exceptionally radical. But what is behind that radical formulation, namely the sense that whatever one says about God falls hopelessly, one might say ridiculously, short of describing God, is almost universal. Or at least I think that one feels that way at certain times, is almost universal. And it's not just that one feels, if one's religious, that one cannot express properly what one means by using the words our language provides to describe God. It is that one feels one cannot mean what one should mean. So we come to the paradox, what I will call the paradox of negative theology. It may seem as if what I'm saying, what I'm claiming the believer wants to say at certain moments, is that there are propositions about God that are true, but that the believer cannot think or even understand. There is, however, something verging on contradiction. I change my mind back and forth on whether it's an outright contradiction, but something verging on contradiction, involved in the thoughts that there are propositions about X which one not only does not understand, but which are by their very nature unintelligible to one. To be sure, some great logicians of the 20th century have denied, in a different context, not a theological context, that such a thought is contradictory. In Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description, Russell works himself into such a position with respect to statements about other selves. Because remember, Russell held that we can understand concepts two ways, by description and by acquaintance. He was inclined to say at that time that each of us is acquainted with his or her own self. He wasn't sure about this, but he was inclined to say that one of the objects of acquaintance is one's own self. And this created a certain problem, because if someone else says, say Bismarck says, I have a toothache, when Bismarck says Bismarck has a toothache or I have a toothache, I directly designates Bismarck's self on Russell's view. But that means that Bismarck uses a proper name which is unintelligible to me. Or he makes a use of the pronoun I, which is unintelligible to me. The proposition Bismarck thinks, and Bismarck thinks I have a toothache, is literally unintelligible to me. Or if Bismarck says Bismarck was an acute diplomatist, again, the proposition is literally unintelligible to everyone else. And Russell thought that somehow I could refer by description, that the theory of definite descriptions wasn't just a logical trick. It was Russell's solution to the problem of reference to other minds, believe it or not, which we often forget now when we teach the theory of descriptions. I can refer to Bismarck's pain by referring to Bismarck's self by a description. Well, but even if Russell felt that his theory of descriptions had eliminated or resolved it, there was a paradox there. For what Russell was saying is that in addition to the judgment that Russell supposes he can make, imagine the judgment that Russell can make is the self associated with such and such a body is subject to a toothache, there is another judgment that only Bismarck can make, in which that same self is referred to by a logically proper name. What makes Russell think this, of course, is that he believes he can think a thought of that kind about himself, the thought he expresses when he thinks, I have a toothache. So he must imagine, concerning the judgment which Bismarck alone can make, that's Russell's own phrase, by the way, the judgment Bismarck alone can make, that it is simultaneously unintelligible to himself and analogous to a judgment he can understand. But in what sense can the unintelligible be analogous to anything I understand? I wrote that it may seem that what the believer wants to say is that there are propositions about God which are true, but which the believer cannot think or even understand. The reason I said seem is that I think the problem the believer faces is even more radical than the one that Russell faced. For proposition, as I understand it, is a term that refers to thought and speech, human thought and speech, and maybe the thought of speech of extraterrestrials or beings that are analogous to humans, although maybe Russell's Platonism would lead him to deny this. To suppose that God literally thinks in propositions in that sense, makes uses of words, would be completely to reject the leading idea of negative theology, the idea that I've been claiming to be prefigured, though not thematized, in ordinary religious consciousness. There are no propositions about God that are adequate to God. That is what one is committed to if one bravely follows out the line of negative theology to the end, as Maimonides did. For Russell, there were substitutes for the judgments about Bismarck that were supposed to be beyond the barrier of intelligibility, substitutes that were supposed to be just as good in a logical sense. But no proposition that human beings can think can be just as good as the what that God is able to know about himself. In fact, if one says that God has an intuitive intellect, that is to say that when God thinks about things, he doesn't need to employ representations which are distinct from the things, that in some way he is able to, what plays the role of the representations, in some way the things themselves, then in God's knowledge about God, what plays the role of the concept of God is God himself. If we follow Maimonides, God cannot literally, quotes, know anything. Knowing is also a positive attribute. Yet, as Ben-Or points out, Maimonides does urge us to speak of God as an intellect and as good, etc. How this comes about is what we shall now examine. I've emphasized how radical Maimonides' form of negative theology was. Here's another aspect of that radicality. For medieval philosophers, existence was simply another attribute. And there's been a lot of discussion, as many of you know, perhaps all of you know, about whether or not that was a mistake or whether that's a legitimate alternative way to construe existence. We get into modal logic and we get into Meinong and for a lot of people nowadays. But in any case, that's what Anselm's ontological proof for the existence of God turned on. But if God has no attributes, and existence is an attribute, what should we conclude if we're forced to say that even, or to force to say that even if we use words like good and exists for these quotes attributes, they don't mean anything like what they mean when applied to anything else? Well, in that case, every quotes proof of God's existence equivocates on the word exist. I think, by the way, although that's not in the written version of this paper, Maimonides has another line of thought driving him strongly to that, which is that he thinks that God is ultimately the only necessary existent, and that necessary existence is just so different from anything we're acquainted with. But as I say, it would seem that although Maimonides doesn't say this, it would seem to follow from his negative theology that every proof of God's existence equivocates on the word exist. Or if not on the word exist, then perhaps on some other word. For example, the cosmological argument is accepted by Maimonides, that reason itself requires that there be an unconditioned ground for the existence of everything conditioned, is something a medieval philosopher cannot doubt. Yet the further reasoning that leads Maimonides to the conclusion that the divine unity excludes the possession of attributes shows that the former reasoning committed the fallacy of equivocation, if either on exist or on cause or whatever the key term may be. This does not lead Maimonides to lose his faith. And you say, well, shouldn't it have? Well, not necessarily. I mean, today, many of you here are aware of the liar paradox. And perhaps you're as uncomfortable as I am with all the proposed solutions of the liar paradox. But that doesn't cause us to lose our faith that there's such a thing as truth. And I think Maimonides had no doubt that God exists, but he felt there's an aporia to which reason leads, one that he says in certain places dazzles the intellect. He also uses repeatedly the metaphor of a tug of war, as if the intellect were pulled or torn apart when it reaches the deepest point in its metaphysical inquiry. But Maimonides emphatically does not tell us to stop talking about God. Indeed, he even tells us how to talk. We can, indeed we must, say that God is good. In the Amidah, or the 18 benedictions, a prayer that they recite, traditional Jews recite twice daily, traditional Jews bless God with the words, we bless God many times in the course of that prayer, but we bless God with the words, "Blessed are you, YHWH, our God, the good is your name, and it is fitting to praise you." Moreover, Maimonides advises us not only to apply attributes of action to God, but even attributes of character, to think of God as the supreme intellect, for example. Ben Or's interpretation of what is going on here is that Maimonides is not opposed to our using inadequate ideas in speaking of God. What he's opposed to, and I think this is correct interpretation, is the unknowing use of inadequate ideas. To use inadequate ideas thinking that one is literally describing God is to fall into idolatry. But that does not mean that adequate ideas are available to us. In the end, even the philosopher must use the inadequate ideas, must thank God and petition God and praise God's wisdom and mercy and goodness and power, because those are the only ideas we have. Similarly, the ordinary believer, whom I've described as also having what we might call a moment of negative theology in his or her religious life, cannot simply keep silent in the face of the unknowability of God, for the awareness of God's transcendence is only one facet of that life, and the other facets, the sense of the availability of God, gratitude to God, the sense of dependence on God, humility before God, require that we speak of God, however inadequate our speaking. What concerns Maimonides is not that we speak of God, but that we tend to fall into idolatry by forgetting how hopelessly inadequate that speaking must be. As Ben Or puts it, I carefully note here that Maimonides considers an inadequate idea of God to be an invention of the imagination only if it is constructed without prior knowledge. The imagination is not bad in itself. In fact, Maimonides says prophecy requires imagination. This leaves room for an inadequate idea of God to be constructed with knowledge, not as a mere product of the imagination. Maimonides' anthropology identifies two cognitive faculties that are capable of positing general conceptions of the world: an intellect that conforms to objective reality, and an imagination that projects a view of the world in the service of human desire. Here I add that this quote from Ben Or is a little misleading in that that's not the only function of imagination. There's also the positive function. In the latter, that is, when imagination is projecting a view of the world in the service of human desire, that, for Maimonides, is the root cause of idolatry, because that sort of imaginative projection is uninterested in correspondence to reality. An inadequate idea of God constructed after knowledge has been achieved can no longer be considered imaginative in this sense, because it already assumes an objective orientation of the mind. This quote is not from Ben Or's book, but from a recent article of Ben Or's called Meaning and Reference in Maimonides' Negative Theology in the Harvard Theological Review for 1995. Maimonides' position has often been analogized to Kant's, and indeed Ben Or speaks of it as constructive theology, a moment which I regret. What these positions have in common is that while indeed our descriptions of God may be better or worse, what makes them better or worse is not that any of them is more accurate, but that some of them are better for us. that is, serve to support our morality in Kant's view, or to produce in us religiously appropriate attitudes, reverence and humility, for example, and to keep us further from materialism and idolatry in Maimonides' view. Yet, persuasive as Ben-Or's reading is, I wonder whether in the end Maimonides' apparent inconsistency in this regard is not fortunate. What I mean by his apparent inconsistency is the fact that as I read him, Maimonides appears to regularly forget that if nothing can be predicated of God, then we cannot even think of God as the unconditioned sufficient reason for the existence of everything conditioned. That he forgets this is, I think, the reason that Maimonides allows us to use attributes of action, and of course I don't think he really forgets it at all, that is to ascribe goodness to God in the sense that the things he brings about are as if they were brought about by a good, intelligent being. I confess that whatever Maimonides' theory of predication with respect to God may logically have required him to maintain, what he writes seemed to me to breathe a deep conviction in the existence of a ground of the whole created world. And I do not believe that in his heart of hearts he regarded this as just an idea that was good for him to have. And I speak of this inconsistency as fortunate because I think that post-Kantian versions of negative theology often involve both a philosophical confusion and a religious confusion. They involve, I think, a philosophical confusion because I think the whole notion of the Ding an sich, which turns all ordinary objects into appearances, is a philosophical confusion. And it's a religious confusion when the constructive theologian speaks of God or of our ideas of God as a construction, as, for example, Walter Kaufmann does. For speaking of, not Walter Kaufmann, Gordon Kaufman does. For instance, speaking of our ideas of God as constructions loses the sense of them as, however, imperfect perspectives. Perspective on something cannot simply be constructed. If it is to be a perspective at all, it must be constrained by what it depicts and not simply by our moral or other needs. Ben-Or brings two additional philosophical ideas to bear in interpreting Maimonides' view, and here I'm going to be more critical of Ben-Or. This is of the article on reference and predication in Maimonides. Drawing upon some of my own work on the semantics of natural kind terms and upon Saul Kripke's work on the semantics of proper names, Ben-Or endorses the view that a term can have reference without being synonymous with any description. The proper names of God are for Maimonides terms of just this kind, according to Ben-Or. They refer to God, but they cannot be unpacked conceptually as conjunctions of attributes. That much is quite right. However, according to Ben-Or, and this I think is wrong, Maimonides does provide what may be called a negative conceptual unpacking, namely by means of a series of negations of attributes. Ben-Or goes on to explain that according to Maimonides, the kind of negation of an attribute that is appropriate in the case of God cannot be construed as an ordinary negative attribute. For example, speaking carefully as a philosopher, very carefully indeed, one may even say that God is not good, not meaning that he has the attribute of not goodness, that is, that God is bad, but that goodness, i.e. the attribute normally referred to by the adjective good, is not predicable of God. Moreover, Ben-Or claims that Maimonides held that the way of negation is sufficient and necessary to determine the reference of God talk. That is, it is possible to fix the reference of God negatively by asserting the totality of all such negations. God is not P, one such negation for each predicate P. Now, I don't find such a theory in the guide, and in any case, I think it wouldn't help. Well, I'll say a couple of words about this, I guess. First of all, the reasons I think that these ideas don't help to eliminate the paradoxes are as follows. First of all, the contemporary semantic theorizing Ben-Or refers to, often referred to as the theory of direct reference, does indeed allow for the possibility of names which have reference but no intention, no description that constitutes their very conceptual content. But both Kripke and myself have had to say something about how we come to master the use of such names, and in our accounts, descriptions do play a role as reference fixers even if the word whose reference they help to fix does not become synonymous with any of those descriptions. For example, in Kripke's account, a baby may be given a proper name, say Paul. The persons participating in the naming ceremony must obviously be able to pick out the baby that is being named. Pick it out, say, as the baby being held by Mrs. Jones. Later on, speakers may be able to use the name Paul without knowing that Mrs. Jones was present at the naming ceremony, and hence without knowing that that description, which along with a number of others could have been used to indicate which child was being named, ever applied to Paul. Some later speaker may simply intend to refer to whoever the speakers from whom he or she learned the relevant use of Paul in turn referred to. However, in the case of the word God or any of the names of God that Maimonides discusses, for example, the Tetragrammaton, there never was a point at which some human speaker was able to indicate to whom he or she was referring by using a literally correct definite description. In the case of God or the Tetragrammaton, quotes God or God or the Tetragrammaton, not only are there no descriptions available which are synonymous with the name, there are no descriptions available to serve as reference fixers in the way in which the baby being held by Mrs. Jones served as a reference fixer. How we come to understand the name of God remains a mystery. It is, of course, just this mystery that what Ben-Or calls the way of negation is supposed to resolve. Now I have a long discussion, which I'll skip, of the way of negation, but I'll come to what seems to be the crucial objection. The problem with the way of negation is how to understand these negative predications. The only way I can see of understanding the negative predications is to understand them as negations of universal quantifications, perhaps universally quantified strict implications, but as negations of some kind of universal quantifications. And that means that we would have to understand these negative predications as having existential import. If you don't understand them as having existential import, then all the negative predications would be equally true of any non-existent object. That is, you could say Pegasus does not have P, Pegasus does not have Q, Pegasus does not have R, and so on. But if you understand them with existential import, so that Pegasus does not have P means Pegasus exists and does not have P, Pegasus does not have Q means there is a Pegasus, and Pegasus does not have Q, and so on, then all right, then you can't say that it's a counterexample to Ben-Or's way of negation, that it works with non-existence. But now you have a different problem. I just worry that subject terms like Pegasus, meaningful but non-referring subject terms, might be a counterexample to Ben-Or's claim. Referring subject terms like Saul Kripke can't be counterexamples because all existent things have essential properties, at least in medieval philosophy. But what happens if we choose as our subject term as a meaningless name, say Gravelboom? Presumably Gravelboom does not have P, is not true, but meaningless. So Maimonides, is interpreted by Ben-Or, seems to be right. The names of God are the only subject terms T such that all the negative predications of the form T is P are true when interpreted, or T is not P as are true when interpreted as negations of strict implications, as we suggested. But that, of course, presupposes that the names are not meaningless terms. But that is so is not explained, but rather presupposed by the negative way. I mean, to put it quite simply, the negative way doesn't really explain why the names of God are meaningful. It presupposes it. And secondly, it also, the very understanding of the negative predications presuppose that we have something analogous to existence, right? That we understand the kind of existential import that's appropriate here. We understand what we're meaning when we say there is a God. But in any case, I don't agree with that reconstruction. So, philosophical answers to Maimonides. Maimonides' radicalism did not, of course, go unchallenged. Perhaps the most famous of his critics was Thomas Aquinas. Now, as the story is usually told, the disagreement between Maimonides and Aquinas is perfectly straightforward. Aquinas, although agreeing that we cannot predicate any attribute of God in the same literal way that we predicate it of a creature, did think that we could predicate goodness, power, wisdom, existence, and the rest of God by analogia, analogy. While this is not exactly false, as usual on closer examination, the situation turns out to be more complicated than this account would suggest. The problem has to do with the nature of analogy. Aquinas is standardly held to have distinguished between two sorts of analogy of attribution and analogy of proportion. But this reading has recently been challenged by McInerney, who holds that Aquinas uses proportion as a synonym for analogy, not as a name of a kind of analogy. However that may be, here's a typical statement by Aquinas on this topic from the Summa Theologica 1a Q13, discussing the application of God to such terms as being and good and wise, after having said that these terms are neither applied univocally nor equivocally, but analogically. Thomas writes, "It should be said, therefore, that names of this kind are said of God and creatures according to analogy, that is, proportion. This occurs in two ways in naming. Either many things have a proportion to one, as healthy is said of medicine and urine, insofar as each is ordered to the health of the animal, of which the latter is the sign and the former is the cause, or one is proportioned to another, as healthy is said of medicine and animal, insofar as the medicine is the cause of the health that is in the animal. And in this way, some things are said analogically and not purely equivocally or univocally of God and creatures. We can only name God from creatures, as was said before. Thus, whatever is said of God and creatures is said insofar as there is a certain order of creature to God as to its principle and cause, in which pre-exist in an excellent manner all the perfections in things. Let me simply note that the analogy between medicine and health in the animal that Aquinas uses in explaining the doctrine of analogical predication strongly suggests that when we call God good or wise or a being, we so refer to him not because he is good or wise or a being in the sense that a creature is, since these terms are not univocally applied to creatures and to God, even though we can only, quotes, only name God from creatures, unquotes, but we apply these names because God is the principle or ground of what we call goodness and wisdom and being in creatures. And this is exactly Maimonides' account of the attributes of action. Another kind of answer entirely, one whose possibility was not missed in the Middle Ages, although it was never accepted as the orthodox view in any of the monotheistic religions, was the answer of nominalists and conceptualists. Although the important differences between those positions, what they shared was the belief that the whole problem of the unity of God, insofar as it led to paradoxes concerning the very possibility of predication, was generated by the reification of attributes. If God has distinct attributes, and attributes have real existence outside the mind, as postulated, though in different ways, by both Aristotle and Plato, and there were many fusions of Platonism and Aristotelianism in late Hellenism and in the especially importantly in the Islamic world, in which, and Maimonides, by the way, functioned within the Islamic philosophical world. His philosophical texts are written. The guide is written in Arabic, not in Hebrew, and he refers with approval to things said by Arabic philosophers. Then, on this sort of Aristotelian cum Platonic cum Neoplatonic view, for God to have more than one attribute is for him to have a kind of internal complexity, to have different and distinguishable universals in himself. But if, on the other hand, attributes are either just names in language or just ideas in the mind, then applying as many of them as you like to a subject does not in itself imply any sort of internal complexity in that subject, unless the attribute itself implies internal complexity. So, as Gersonides, for one, maintained, we should get rid of the whole problem of negative theology by scrapping the bad philosophy that led to it. case you think this is a 20th century move. It's been around for a while. However, it seems to me that a simple rejection of the problem would be a profound mistake. If Maimonides emphasized the error of supposing that one can think of God as good in the sense in which a human being may be more or less good, or as wise in the sense in which a human being may be more or less wise, or as having power in the sense in which a human being may have more or less power, this was not simply because he made a theoretical mistake, if he did, about the nature of predication or the problem of universals. It is because he was concerned to combat the temptation to what he called idolatry and what we today call fundamentalism. And similarly, if Aquinas, although also concerned with the danger of idolatry, wished to stress that there is a sense in which we can believe that God possesses wisdom and goodness and power, and not just say that, it's because he was concerned to combat a different religious temptation, one that he saw Maimonides as succumbing to, which we may describe as the temptation to a mysticism, even if it's a mysticism generated from logic, that empties God of all content and thereby threatens the availability of God. Those spiritual issues were all the more profound because the relations between philosophy and religion were so complex. On the one hand, issues which had always been philosophical issues, creation ex nihilo versus the eternity of the world, the freedom of the will, the existence of evil, the immortality of the soul, which might or might not be understood by a philosopher as what we call personal immortality, the nature and possibility of human happiness, the relations between knowledge and virtue, all took on added poignancy when they became fused with the concerns of revealed religious traditions. Conversely, revealed religion was itself deeply changed by its contact with Greek philosophy. Such doctrines as the immateriality of God, the omniscience of God, and the omnipotence of God may be, as William James charged, the product of the philosophy shop, but they've undeniably become part of the religious consciousness of hundreds of millions of believers. In spite of the intimacy of these relations, there's also an obvious difference between ordinary religious belief and the religious belief of a philosopher like Maimonides. On the view of religious language I ascribe to Wittgenstein, it is not in the end the theories of predication of a Maimonides or Gersonides or Aquinas that can speak to the problem faced by the believer in the moment I described as having something in common with negative theology. According to Wittgenstein, as I said, the intelligibility of what Benor calls God talk is secured by the standing possibility of understanding and participating in the forms of life with which that talk is interwoven, the quotidian religious forms of life, and not by the abstruse reasoning of neo-Aristotelian or Neoplatonic theology. This view would be out of the question for Maimonides because of his allegiance to philosophy as he conceived it. Philosophy is a 1,000-year-old way of life, which holds out its own problem of a kind of salvation through philosophical understanding, a promise which, alas, the many are not supposed to be able to appreciate. The great French historian of philosophy, Pierre Hadot, H-A-D-O-T, has recently been translated into English. One of his great works on this, called Philosophy as a Way of Life, was published by Blackwell last year, which traces this way in which philosophy itself was very close, in all its different schools, was very close to what we would call a religion. Hadot's term is a set of spiritual exercises for over 1,000 years. And of course, there was an elitist element to Maimonides' view, because though salvation promised by philosophy is one which, alas, the many are not supposed to be able to understand or appreciate. Maimonides' problem was generated by his unique realization that philosophy itself, the only form of religious thought worthy of the name in his view, cannot reach to the comprehension of the deity. His problem then becomes, as Benor describes, one of securing reference without comprehension. On the Wittgensteinian account, on the other hand, there's a different difficulty, one which the language game theologies I rejected try to sweep under the rug. We may, in a sense, understand religious language through our potential for participating in the forms of life which are its home. But how does that language come to connect us with one who transcends all our forms of life? There is a mystery here, I would say, but it's a religious mystery and not a philosophical problem calling for a theory of predication. As Franz Rosenzweig held, it is the primal right of human beings to give names, to create and speak languages. But our language is also the language that we use to speak to God, and that God uses to speak to us in Scripture. That religious language connects us to God, is something one can feel with one's whole being, not something that one can explain. Pace Maimonides, it is not the theoretical intellect that connects us to the divine. Thank you.